Hello, Wuju Senshi here, and today I'm bringing you my updated, most up-to-date Master Yi guide for Season 11, how to build them, what runes to take, all of that. You might have noticed several things. For one thing, you might have noticed I posted a previous guide going over the Google Doc you see on the screen right now. And a lot of things have changed since that guide was posted, and the Google Doc here, I've been keeping it up to date since then, constantly updating it as the meta's evolved, as I figured out things regarding how you should actually build them, and seeing what other emates have been doing as well. So a lot has changed, as well as patches. A lot has changed. So I wanted to give you a really the most up to date Yi guide I could. Now that season 11 is going to be starting, I think tomorrow, so that you'll be most informed when you start your ranked climb. Also, and another thing you may have noticed is maybe my voice sounds a little bit different or weird compared to how you've heard it on stream or in in other YouTube videos. That's because I got this new mic, which I'm testing. So hopefully that ends up coming out fine when this video gets posted. But yeah, without further ado, I'll just jump right into it. So I'll start with the mythics. So the mythics, for the most part, I still think that Krakenslayer and Duskblade are the best mythics for Yi. In a previous video, I said that, or in the previous guide that I made, I said Krakenslayer was the best one. But the Duskblade build has definitely emerged as a very strong and viable, if not even the more OP build. So Duskblade as a mythic, as well as the build that comes with Duskblade, very much a great option in the right game. I think that there are other mythics that are not that bad. I guess we'll talk about those now. So Immortal Shield Bow and Eclipse, I think those are mythics that a lot of emates were trying a lot when they first, like towards the beginning of preseason in the early stages, but nowadays pretty much no one builds these items for the most part, and I think for good reason. I don't think they're that, in some situations maybe they're okay, but for the most part you're gonna often prefer Kraken and Duskblade compared to these mythics. So you don't really build them that often, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily bad. And in certain games, they might actually be a decent option. Galeforce is a mythic that I actually think is underrated and pretty underutilized for Yi in a lot of situations. There's a lot of games where you don't actually necessarily need more damage, and you just need more, chase potential, gap closing, etc. And Galeforce provides that. So I'll talk more in detail later about the Galeforce build, or at least how I think you would utilize it. But definitely Galeforce is one of the more underrated mythics in my opinion, where most people are just building Kraken and Duskblade nowadays. These other mythics, and as well as pretty much every other mythic, I don't think Yi's not gonna really build any of the other mythic items for the most part. There are some other mythics that maybe are at least somewhat, like a tiny bit viable on Yi, but basically you'll never build any of these mythics unless you just want to have fun. But I'll just talk about them briefly. Sometimes in a very, very rare, like once in 100 game situation, it might actually not be that bad, or might even be a good choice compared to the other mythics I talked about. But yeah, it's very rarely a good choice, in my opinion. But I'll talk about this now. Prowler's Claw, Gourd Drinker, Turbo Chem Tank, Sunfire. The Sunfire build was really popular at one point. The Gourd Drinker on Yi was something people were trying a lot at one point. But I think both these, as well as other mythics, are just not as good on Yi compared to the other ones, plain and simple. There is a haste build with Gourd Drinker that can sometimes be used. But yeah, I mean, I'll talk about it a little bit later. But yeah, those are the mythics that's basically the story on mythics. You're basically going Kraken and Duskblade in 99% of your games. At least if you're following my recommendations. So when it comes to legendary items, the items that I think are the strongest on Yi when it comes to legendary items are Rageblade, Phantom Dancer, Ravenous Hydra, Death Dance, Wits End, Sterak's Gauge. I think Sterak's Gauge is one that you'll hear me mentioning a lot as I talk about this guide. You can actually build Sterak's Gauge in pretty much any build, because it's just such an OP defensive item. Whether you're going a crit build, the Duskblade build, the Kraken build, whatever, Sterak's Gauge works in every build. Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about how Rageblade, Death Dance, Wits End, these items have changed compared to last season. And in a lot of ways, they're not quite what they used to be. You could say they're not as core to Yi, they're not as required. Maybe they're in some ways, especially Death Dance Wits End, not as good or OP as they used to be. But they're still, in most situations, especially when you're going on hit builds, it's very rare that you won't get some good value out of building these items. And also say that Ravenous Hydra, I think, is the new go-to item if you want to be a drain tank, similar to Season 10 Yi. Um, yeah, and I guess I'll say something about Season 10 versus Season 11. Season 10 Yi, you pretty much go the same build every game. There was one build that was viable and you would have very little variation, but this season I think there's a lot more versatility in how you can build Yi. A lot of different builds that can work really well. And it's more about this season figuring out what's the best build for the game you're in, taking into consideration your team comp, the enemy team comp, who's weak, who's strong on both teams, what's your role to play in the team, things like that. So that's basically the scoop on the legendary items. These are the best legendary items in my opinion. If you were to build, basically these items every game with, your Kraken, not really, you wouldn't build a lot of these items with Duskblade. So actually this is more like for a Kraken build. But yeah, if you were to build every single game, you'd probably be in decently good shape. But that doesn't mean I recommend that. I still think it's more advantageous to build the correct specific items for each game that game needs, if that makes sense. I'll talk a little bit about the other legendary items that I think are still good on Yi, but definitely not as powerful or kind of universal as these legendary S tier items. So the A tier legendary items, you have Bork here. That's one I think that's worse compared to Season 10 version of Bork. I very rarely build this unless they have a lot of tanks. GA was an item that I used to recommend a lot. In Season 10 I built it a lot, but I think it's actually fallen out of favor this season. So I don't build GA very often. And yeah, I think it's not bad, but just it's kind of been overshadowed by a lot of the other more strong items that have emerged. Mortal Reminder is one that you, of course, obviously build when you need a lot of grievous wounds, healing reduction, and it's pretty important this season. There's a lot of healing in the game, and grievous wounds has been buffed to 60% now as well, so it's a great item in those situations, but only in those situations. A lot of these crit items are, things that you're going to build them in crit builds, and the crit items are actually very strong in my opinion. So I guess putting them in A tier doesn't actually mean that they're, they are very strong whenever you go the crit build, but I guess what I'm trying to say here is when I put these crit items in A tier and not S tier, I'm saying that the crit build I don't think is necessarily good in every single game. It's because you lack a lot of defensive, basically it's just not as much of a defensive build, more of a squishy build compared to the on-hit build. I'll talk a little bit about here Silvermere Dawn. I'll mention this briefly, how I think it's an underrated item that's kind of, I think a lot of Yi mains are sleeping on it. It's basically Mercurial Scimitar, except that when you use the QSS active, you get 40% tenacity for 3 seconds after it. So it's a really great item to champions like Leona on the enemy team, other comps with a lot of CC. Really nice item. Also gives HP and AD and MR. Yeah, I think it's an item a lot of Yi mains are sleeping on. And I definitely would pick this up, especially in on-hit builds when the enemy has a lot of CC. Deadman's, Randuin's, not much else to say about those. I guess I'll mention Deadman's. You can replace boost with this item because it gives 5% movement speed in addition to the MS you get with the stacks. So it's a good way to replace your tabby, or your plated steel caps I should say, with Deadman's. Randuin's, I don't build it that often. It's kind of the same thing it used to be for the most part. Gargoyles is an item that I used to think we wouldn't build on Yi, but now I've decided you actually can. It's actually pretty good because it gives dual resistances, and you can stack it with Sterak's Gauge, get like a double shield. Basically makes you impossible to be bursted with Gargoyles and Sterak's together. So in games you really need that anti-burst protection, Gargoyles is super nice. Also, I'll talk briefly about Zanya's. I do think Zanya's is actually not even a joke, like very viable on Yi this season, even better than GA, which is like an item that's designed for champions like Yi, 80 damage carries like Yi. Zanya's is, I think, something I prefer to build on a champion like Yi even more than GA, and that's just showing how strong Zanya's is right now. And I'm not trying to meme, I'm not trying to like make a point about how I think Zanya's is so broken or OP. It's really just genuinely viable on Yi because it's designed for champions who are assassins, right? But they don't want to get bursted, and they need to outplay. Yi is all those things. Even though he's not an AP assassin, he's still an assassin that gets up in people's faces and needs to explode people, but then be able to survive so you can continue getting resets, continue carrying a fight. And this season, when there's so much damage in the game, Zanya's is super nice to have in a lot of those games, especially against, assassins or burst damage, things like that. So you get Zanya's not for the AP obviously, but it gives you a lot of armor, as well as the active obviously. So that's what I'll say about that. Edge of Night is another item, a lethality item that I think a lot of Yi mains sleep on. It's more heavily utilized by Korean high elo Yis, and it's only really with the Duskblade crit build that you'll see Edge of Night get pulled out. But it's actually, I think, really good in, as an outplay tool, basically, in the Duskblade crit build. So basically, I think it's worth putting on this list. But and when I've used it, I feel like it's actually really nice, but it's still somewhat niche. When it comes to, so those are the A tier legendary items. When it comes to the B tier legendary items, these are items that I think you almost never build on Yi. In fact, I've pretty much never built any of these legendary items, like even once in any game this preseason. I very rarely build any of these. I don't think you'll pretty much build them ever in, throughout season 11 unless things change. And it's sad because a lot of these items, or like the ones that were, the ones that were updated from old versions from season 10, they used to be good items on Yi. Titanic Hydra, Black Cleaver, I used to like building those items on Yi in certain situations. Yomu's maybe sometimes as well, but now I think they're all just not that good, or just overshadowed by other items that are way better. So that's all I'll say about the B tier items. So my goal this video is to not be talking for too long. So I've already been talking for 11 minutes. So I'm going to try and give you a TLDR on the builds. And this Google Doc, by the way, will be linked in the description below. So you'll be able to see everything I'm talking about here. It's free for everyone to access. It's public on the internet. So you can look over everything I've written in this doc, which is very extensive. You'll see it's pretty long here. There's a lot in there. You can read about more of the details there. But I'm going to give you basically the TLDR right now of how I think you should be built, what are the best builds in my experience, yada yada yada. And also, if you want to hear more from other Yi mains about what they think is the best way to play Yi this season, specifically high elo Yi mains like Cowsep and Danijrm, I did a podcast / seminar with them talking about Master Yi for about 5 hours just about a week ago, and that's posted on my YouTube channel as well. I'll post a link to that also in the description below. And yeah, they have different perspectives from me in a lot of things. I think both Danny and Cowsep really love the Duskblade build and don't think any of the other builds are that good. But that's their opinion. This is my opinion. And, you can listen to what they have to say, listen to what I have to say, and make your own judgment. But, yeah, just want to throw that out there that they might have some different opinions from what I have. But I've done a lot of testing when I'm playing in my on my NA accounts in High, Diamond, and Master. And this is what I've kind of found to be the best builds that are most successful for me. So without further ado, let me jump into those. So there are basically 4 builds, but it's kind of more like 2. 3 of these builds are just variations of a Kraken on hit / or not on hit, but like a Kraken attack speed build. But yeah, so there's basically 4 builds, but also kind of basically 2. So the first build I'll talk about here is the standard on hit build. This one's the most similar to season 10 Master Yi. You'll rush Kraken, your Mythic, and you'll get Rageblade second, and then you'll get third either Wits or Death's Dance. Fourth item you want to get is Sterax, and then your last item I think could be Hydra. I mentioned before how Hydra I think is the new drain tank like king item. If you really want to be a drain tank, you need Hydra in my opinion. But you could also not get Hydra 5th item and just get Wits End or Death's Dance, whatever you didn't get is your 3rd item. So that could be something like Kraken, Rageblade, Wits, Sterax, Death's Dance, or Kraken, Rageblade, Death's Dance, Sterax, Wits. You could do that as well. But in most situations, I think it's pretty uncommon, I guess, for me personally to get both Death's Dance and Wits End. I think I'd rather get something like the Hydra. And then here's some situational items here that I've listed in the doc. Again, you're not going to be building these, it's situational, obviously. It doesn't mean you build it that often. But I include these. I think these are the major situational items that, even though you're not building them that often, these are the ones that you'll probably, they're the most important or viable situational items that I listed here. So it's similar to season 10 Yi. It's pretty self-explanatory, and I think it's viable in almost every single game. So if you want to find a build to just, if you don't want to think much about builds, you just want to find something to do every single game, this build is it, in my opinion. This is it, and it's always doing good, always going to do good damage, always going to scale well. It's similar to season 10 Yi playstyles. You don't have to really do much different. And it's got good defensive. This important thing. It's got a good defensive like capabilities built into the build, which you really need this season as Yi because there's a lot of damage in the meta in the way the game is right now. So, moving on here, the lethal tempo hybrid build. So I should mention this, and this applies to the on-hit build as well. I pretty much never go Conquer anymore. I'm taking lethal tempo in almost every single game, and it feels really, really good. I'm totally converted to lethal tempo. I loved that rune, and for a long time I was so sad that it was bad because Conquer was king. But now that Conquer's been nerfed, you get a lot less healing from it. And even though you get a little more AD from it, you get tons of AD from the Season 11 items anyway. So the AD on Conqueror is not that important. The loss of healing from Conqueror, the way it was nerfed now, that feels really bad. And also you lack attack speed in your build, especially early game, because you don't have the Blood Razor rush from Season 10. You're rushing Kraken now, gives less attack speed. All these factors come together to make lethal tempo to feel really good right now, and also getting lots of Kraken procs off feels really, really good. So unless you're going the Duskblade crit build, I think any Kraken build, and even pretty much just any build in general that isn't the Duskblade crit build, lethal tempo is the one I prefer the most. I love it. And I also, another interesting thing that maybe I'll touch on a little bit later, is I love taking Ghost now, unless I really need Flash or really need Ignite or really need Exhaust or whatever. Ghost, I think, is really nice for being able to chase down enemies and carry team fights. I guess like the main thing is with lethal tempo, Ghost lets you stick onto enemies and get lots of your lethal tempo auto attacks off before your lethal tempo expires. And just generally, it feels really, it just feels like a really nice carry explosive playstyle. So I just wanted to throw that in there. With this on-hit build, I'd almost never take Conqueror. I'm pretty much taking lethal tempo every single game. I don't know if I'm ever going to really need Conqueror again. I think the only times Conqueror is sometimes maybe better than lethal tempo is if you really are not going to be able to auto attack basically, like very rarely, and lethal tempo relies on you get auto attacks off with your 6-second duration. So if you're against a team where you're not going to be able to do that, maybe they have tons of invisibility, tons of CC, maybe Conqueror is better. But I think most of the time I really prefer lethal tempo, like maybe 95 or 99% of games. So I just wanted to mention that about this on-hit build. These other two builds, again, with lethal tempo, I think is the best setup. So the lethal tempo hybrid build is very similar actually to this standard on-hit build, except that it's a PD second item build instead of Rageblade. PD, I think, and the reason it's called hybrid is because with PD you can still crit. So you're doing Kraken PD as your first two items, which are crit items. So you're able to crit, but then you transition into on-hit items like Wit's End, Death Dance, Sterax, Hydra, kind of very similar to the on-hit build. Usually you'll choose Wit's End or Death Dance. Again, you won't really get both most of the time. And it's a build that is doing lots of on-hit damage and is giving you defensive capabilities in that way. But you still can crit and do lots of damage to squishies, and you have a better early game as well with Kraken and PD. Not because it does necessarily more damage, because you stick to people really well, and the crits are really nice against squishies, critting with your Q as well as your auto attacks. So this build is actually probably the build I go the most nowadays in Season 11. I think I most often go this Kraken PD into lethal, into the on-hit items build. And yeah, just feels really good. So I recommend you give it a try. I got the idea for this build from a Chinese challenger, Master Yiming, who was running lethal tempo and Kraken PD as their early kind of like their core setup, and it feels really good. So I just recommend you give it a try. And with this build, you can throw an IE in there if you want to get full crit. You can also throw in Zani's, like I mentioned, it's really strong. I think that's it for that. The third build I'll talk about here, which is just another Kraken build, but it's more crit focused, not really any on-hit involved, is the lethal tempo crit build. Again, with crit, Kraken, PD, except instead of on-hit items after your PD, you're going to get IE. IE and crit items in general work really well with you this season. They're very strong. And then after IE, you can get like Bloodthirster 4th, Lord Dominic's Regards 5th. Again, Armor Pen really important for crit builds. I'm sure you know that. There are variations of this, definitely lots of variations where you could build. I mean, you could throw Essence Reaver in there, Quick Blades in there. You could throw Mercurial Scimitar. You could even throw items like Sterax and Death's Dance, which are not crit items, but they're just so good at what they do. Sterax, like I mentioned, just OP item, can go in any build and be really useful. Death's Dance really good against champs that do a lot of 80 damage. You can throw that in there and it's still going to be great. You don't need 100% crit for a crit build to work well. And since this build is pretty squishy, sometimes you really want those kinds of items. But yeah, generally this crit build, it does really well in doing obviously lots of 80 damage. If your team has a lot of AP damage, you know, and you're one of the only 80 champs on your team, crit build is really great because your enemy won't be building a lot of armor. And just generally it does really nice explosive damage. You can still shred through tanks, not quite as well as the on-hit build, but still, you know, well enough. And of course explode squishies really quickly, instantly, you know. It still scales well, not quite as well as on-hit, but it's still a very good build. I think the main weakness in that is that you're more squishy, so you're doing more of a trade-off for like explosive damage and giving up some defensive capability. But in games where you don't need that defense as much, if the enemy is, you know, a comp that doesn't do as much damage and they're more squishy and they're more like, you know, champs that you can just explode, then Lethal Tempo Crit works great. If you want to go even further into the one-shot territory, the Duskblade crit build, which is the one that is probably the most popular now among Yi mains, and it's definitely the build that Cowsep and Danny prefer. I think it's the only build that they run nowadays on Yi. And it's probably the one that is the most OP one on Yi. Honestly, I have to say it feels kind of unfair when I play this build. It is this Duskblade crit build. This one is, I think, the best build. If the enemy team comp has a lot of squishies or is all squishies, you're basically trolling if you don't go this Duskblade crit build, which is Duskblade into Essence Reaver. You can go Collector, second item, but I've actually found Essence Reaver to be an item I prefer more as your second item rush. So Collector is only an item I really think is decent if you're really ahead. You want to get lots of the executes off, lots of the, you know, extra gold from the executes. The lethality can help you one-shot with your Q. But for the most part, Essence Reaver, it scales better. The Spellblade also scales really well, and the one-shot Q into auto Spellblade damage it does with Essence Reaver feels really, really nice. And with Duskblade, by the way, you'll be taking Hail Blades. I think that's pretty much the best keystone 99% of the time on this build. And then after Essence Reaver, you'll go Infinity Edge. And so you're probably wondering, you need 6% crit to get Infinity Edge to work, right? So why do you go Infinity Edge second item? You don't have 6% crit. What you do is you build Infinity Edge as well as crit cloaks at the same time. So after Essence Reaver, you have 20% crit. You'll start building IE components and maybe pick up some crit cloaks as well. You could even buy 3 crit cloaks out of the shop right on your back if you want. And by the time you finish IE, you also want to have 2 crit cloaks in your inventory. So by the time you finish IE, you'll have Duskblade, ER, IE, and 2 crit cloaks. That gives you 70% crit total and lets you get usage out of the IE. This is, I think, better in my opinion, getting the early IE power spike instead of having to build a whole extra crit item and then building IE. I think that delays IE a lot more than I'd want to, and just the IE power spike feels so good. So I often try to go this route. It is a little bit inconvenient, the build path, because you have to build IE as well as the crit cloaks for it to all come together and work. But you don't necessarily have to do this. You could just build Collector, third item, or, you know, Quick Blades as well. It's up to you, but I prefer most games to try and build IE third item along with some crit cloaks in this build. After IE, you can get things like the Quick Blades or Lord Dominic's Regards, again, very important for these AD builds. You can get things like, there's a lot of options actually with this build. You can get Sterax, again, OP in every build. You can get defensive crit items like Mercurial Bloodthirster. You can get Zanya's OP item with Assassins, right, even for Yi. Edge of Night, I mentioned that as well. And Death's Dance, I talked about that before earlier. So this is kind of my attempt at making a TLDR on how I think you should build Yi this season, preseason, or not preseason, in season 11, in your ranked games. Basically, you're going to be going Croc into Rageblade or PD, and then you can build on-hit items or crit items after that. Of course, you don't build the crit items after Rageblade, but if you go PD, you build crit items if you want. And that's with Lethal Tempo. Or you can go the Duskblade route with Halo Blades and go crit items. You could potentially go lethality items with that as well, but for the most part, I think the Duskblade into crit items is the most powerful way to play that build. If you want to learn more about, details about how to play these builds, I have outlined them in much more detail in the doc, which, again, links in the description below. You can read all about it. I go over a lot of details in this doc about how to play these builds and different build paths, different options. But for the most part, I explained to you kind of the gist about the big things I guess you need to know about these builds. And that should pretty much leave you set to, that should be everything you need for the most part for, building Yi this season. At least in the beginning of season 11, until things change a lot. I'll talk very briefly about some kind of more interesting builds for Yi that I think are sometimes okay, but it's very, very niche situations, I think, where you'd actually want this build over the other builds I talked about. But I'll just go over them quickly just for the heck of it. So the haste spam build is where you go Gore Drinker, which is an item that has an active that actually is reduced, the cooldown's reduced by ability haste. So the idea is to go Gore Drinker and then build a lot of haste items like Quick Blades, and then Essence Reaver or Black Cleaver, and then you can get even like Hydra or Zanyas after that. And you're going to be spamming your Q and your Gore Drinker because you have a lot of haste. And this build can be really disruptive because you're constantly in Alpha Strike, and able to heal up whenever you're caught out of position with your Gore Drinker and Alpha Strike again, or Zanyas and then keep Alpha Striking. So it does a lot of damage with your Q. This pretty much most of your damage is through your Q, but it's not always necessarily the best build. I do think it has viability in certain situations though. The other build I'll talk about here is one that I kind of invented myself, and it's with Eclipse. Eclipse is one of those items that kind of gives Yi everything that he wants, except for attack speed, but it gives him pretty much a little bit of everything. Some Omnivamp, some shielding, some movement speed, AD lethality, just like a little bit of everything he would want, especially early game. So getting Eclipse as an early game rush is really nice, and it pretty much sets you up. Like with that item, you can pretty much one-shot squishies or kill them very easily for the rest of the game. So with Eclipse, you go into, also Prowler's Claw could potentially work with this, but I think Eclipse is better. You can go Eclipse into pretty much just defensive, or like utility items, like Edge of Night for the spell shield, Zanya's GA, just a lot of tools, and maybe some armor pen as well, so you scale into late game. A lot of just these tools to help you not die or not get CC when you're trying to assassinate the backline, or assassinate squishies, the carries. This is a build I've tried only a few times in preseason, maybe like 5-6 times, but every time I've done it, it's felt really good. And it's more of a team-focused build. If you don't have competent teammates, it's going to be very difficult for you to 1v9 with this build. So it's more of like an assassin, very much an assassin-focused playstyle, but less like 1v9 compared to the Duskblade build. That's all I'll say about that. You can try it sometimes. I think it's fun to be able to have a spell shield, a Zanya's, and a GA on a champ like Yi while still being able to kill carries. So I've had fun with it whenever I use it. Tank, Yi is a build that was, I mentioned how Sunfire, there were a lot of Yi players trying that out at one point. I think these tanky builds are just not as good anymore. A lot of the items are just not what they used to be. But if you were to go a tank Yi playstyle, you'd probably go into something like Bork, Rageblade, and then your Mythic could be either Chem Tank or Sunfire. Both are probably going to be about as viable. And then into tank items like Sterax, Gargoyles, or the Titanic Hydra. I have never gone this build, and I don't think I ever will. But if you want to go a tanky playstyle, that's what I think the best version of it would be right there. The last build I'll talk about today is the Galeforce build. And I did mention before how I think Galeforce is really underrated. And actually, it's basically just a variation of the crit build. Instead of Kraken PDIE, you'll go Galeforce PDIE. And it feels really good into matchups where you need the movement speed and you don't need the extra damage that Kraken gives you. So Galeforce is an item that gives you the gap close every 60 seconds, right? But also does a lot of execute damage as well when you do the dash and it shoots the little missiles. So it's a really nice item into champions. Like, I always think of Nidalee as the matchup that I love taking Galeforce into, because I don't need extra damage to one-shot Nidalee. I just need to get on top of her, and she has all those dashes and stuff, and you know, if I can close onto her with Galeforce, really nice. I'll always be able to one-shot her, especially with the crit build. So the way you go Galeforce build, I think you would go with lethal tempo, but you could take phase rush. Honestly, it's kind of troll, but it's not, you know, if we want to live the movement speed fantasy, sure, take phase rush, ghost as well, blue smite while you're at it. Maybe you'll build a Youmuu's at some point too, but basically you'll go Galeforce, PD, IE, and then after that you can get movement speed items like Deadman's or Force of Nature, maybe Wit's End. Maybe you can get a Mercurial Scimitar or Youmuu's, as I mentioned. Yeah. And I can't remember if I already mentioned this in the video, but I'm basically taking Ghost every single game nowadays. Of course, Ghost works really well with this Galeforce build that I mentioned, but forget the Galeforce build. I'm taking Ghost with all the builds I've mentioned pretty much, whether it's the on-hit build, whether it's the, you know, crit on-hit, or the crit, you know, lethal tempo version, even even with Duskblade. Ghost is like pretty much my new favorite summoner spell, even though I was taking Ignite in most of my games in Season 10. Ghost nowadays just feels really good to be able to have that, like, fake, it's basically like having a Yi R, Master Yi R, but pre-6. So you'll have it as a summoner spell, and it's really nice in situations when you want to get away or when you want to chase people down. In late game, it also does really well at letting you kind of fight on your terms. And then also chase kills down. There's a lot of mobility in the game, and Ghost can help you kind of chase people down even when they dash really far away. Yeah, I mean, of course, there are times where you really need Ignite or really need Flash or really need Exhaust or whatever, but Ghost, I think, is really my new favorite summoner spell that I'm taking in most of my games, whether it's the Kraken build or the Duskblade build. So yeah, I've been talking for a long time. That's pretty much all I want to talk about here. If you have any feedback, let me know in the comments below. You can also contact me on Discord. It's listed here on the Google Doc or on Twitter. If you want to track my progress, you can check out my OPGG build testing account here. I've been playing on this Senshi account mostly, but once season starts, I'll probably be playing on my main as well. If you want to watch me, you know, keep track of the games in real time, you can follow my Twitch and hang out with me there, and we can talk more there as well. But yeah, that's pretty much all I gotta say. And good luck with your season 11 climb. I hope these builds help you do well with Yi in season 11. I really think he's not in that bad of a spot, honestly. I think he can actually be very strong, even with the nerfs and everything. So yeah, wish you the best of luck, and I'll see you in the next video.